For more than 15 years, Scott Peterson lived in one of the most controlled environments in the California prison system. Every movement monitored, every interaction restricted, every day nearly identical to the one before it. If there was one thing prison officials knew how to do, it was keep Scott Petersons separated from the general prison population. Then California changed the rules. They took one of the most recognizable inmates in America off death row and placed him in a prison where hundreds of other men could see him, recognize him, talk about him, and form their own opinions about what he deserved. For a while, nothing happened. Then came March 9th, 2025. A prison yard, a pickleball game, a man running across the court, and seconds later, Scott Peterson was being attacked. Correctional officers rushed toward the violence. Chemical agents were deployed. Batons were used. The situation escalated so quickly that prison staff had to use force to stop it. But that isn't the part that should make you uncomfortable. The uncomfortable part came later, because the inmate who attacked Scott Peterson claimed he didn't even know who Scott Peterson was. Think about that for a moment. The man who attacked one of the most infamous inmates in America wasn't targeting him because of the case. He wasn't seeking revenge. He wasn't trying to make a name for himself. According to his own account, he didn't even know who he was hitting. And if that's true, then what does that say about the hundreds of inmates who do know exactly who Scott Peterson is? Because many inmates inside Mule Creek State Prison know the story. They know about Christmas Eve 2002. They know about Lassie Peterson. They know about Connor Peterson. They know about the trial. They know about the verdict. And they know that the man convicted in one of the most infamous murder cases in modern American history is now walking the same yard they are. Then the inmate who attacked Peterson was asked a simple question. Why? His answer was 4 words. 4 words that instantly transformed a prison fight into a national headline. It was God's plan. More than 20 years after the murder case that made him famous, Scott Peterson is no longer sitting on death row. The death sentence is gone. The isolation is gone. The protections that came with it are gone. And the deeper you look into his life in prison today, the more one disturbing question begins to emerge. Did Scott Peterson actually leave behind the harshest part of his punishment, or did it only begin when California moved him out of death row? Before we continue, this video discusses a real criminal case involving the deaths of Lassie Peterson and her unborn son, Connor Peterson. Some viewers may find parts of this story upsetting. Viewer discretion is advised. To understand why that question is being asked at all, we need to go back to the decision that changed Scott Peterson's future forever. August 24th, 2020. Nearly 16 years after a jury sentenced Scott Peterson to death, the California Supreme Court made a decision that sent shockwaves through one of the most infamous criminal cases in modern American history. The court overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence, but there was something many of the headlines didn't fully capture. Scott Peterson had not won his freedom. His convictions remained intact. The court did not find him innocent. The court did not order his release. And the court did not overturn the jury's conclusion that he was responsible for the deaths of Lassie Peterson and their unborn son, Connor. Instead, the ruling focused on something far more technical: jury selection. The justices concluded that during the original trial, prospective jurors had been improperly dismissed because they expressed general opposition to the death penalty. Under long-established legal precedent, simply opposing capital punishment is not enough to remove someone from a death penalty case. The key question is whether that person can still follow the law and consider all sentencing options fairly. The California Supreme Court found that several jurors had been excluded without that standard being properly applied. As a result, the penalty phase of the trial could no longer stand. The sentence was overturned, the convictions were not, and almost immediately, confusion followed. Across television networks, newspapers, and online forums, many people interpreted the ruling as a major victory for Scott Peterson. Some even wondered whether he might eventually walk free, but that wasn't what had happened. The state's highest court had drawn a clear line. The murder convictions remained in place. Only the punishment had changed. For the Peterson family, the ruling reopened wounds they had spent years trying to live with. For nearly 2 decades, they had endured appeals, hearings, legal challenges, documentaries, and endless public debate surrounding the case. Now the story was back in the national spotlight once again. And for Scott Peterson, the decision appeared to mark the beginning of a new chapter. To the outside world, it looked like a dramatic improvement. No more death sentence. No more waiting for an execution that might never come. No more living under the label of a condemned inmate. People assumed his life had just become easier. In fact, many observers believed he had received the break of a lifetime. But prison isn't always that simple, because what most people saw was the sentence he was leaving behind. What they didn't see was the protection he was leaving behind. And that distinction would become far more important than anyone realized, because the prison Scott Peterson was about to leave had been shielding him in ways that most inmates never experience. And once that protection disappeared, everything changed. To understand why Scott Peterson's transfer out of death row would eventually become so important, you first have to understand what life on California's death row actually looked like. For years, the public tended to think of death row in simple terms: a place where condemned inmates waited to be executed, a harsher punishment, a worse existence. And in many ways, it was. After being sentenced to death in 2005, Scott Peterson was sent to San Quentin State Prison, the facility that housed California's condemned male inmates. At the time, San Quentin's death row was the largest in the Western Hemisphere, holding hundreds of inmates sentenced to die. This was not general population. It was a separate world, a world built around control, a world built around isolation, a world built around waiting. Peterson spent year after year inside that environment while appeals slowly moved through the courts. His daily existence was governed by rules that touched nearly every aspect of his life: where he could go, when he could go there, who he could see, who he could talk to, and how long he could remain outside his cell. Former California death row inmates have described a routine dominated by restrictions, repeated searches, controlled movement, and extensive separation from the rest of the prison population. The days blended together, then the weeks, then the months, then the years. While the outside world moved forward, life inside death row often seemed frozen in place. And hanging over everything was a reality that never completely disappeared: the sentence, the knowledge that a jury had condemned you to die. Even though California had not carried out an execution since 2006, the sentence remained. The appeals continued. The uncertainty continued. The waiting continued. For some inmates, that waiting became one of the hardest parts of death row itself. Not knowing what would happen, not knowing when. Living year after year in a system designed around a punishment that might never actually be carried out. Psychologists and legal scholars have long discussed the emotional strain that can come from spending decades under a death sentence, trapped between two realities. Not free, but not facing an immediate execution either. But there was another side to death row that most people rarely talked about. A side that would become extremely important once Scott Peterson left it behind. Because death row didn't just isolate inmates from society, it isolated them from other prisoners. The separation was intentional. Condemned inmates did not move through prison the way general population inmates did. They did not spend their days surrounded by hundreds of other prisoners. They were physically separated from that world. And for Scott Peterson, that separation mattered. Because Scott Peterson wasn't just another inmate. He was one of the most recognizable prisoners in America. His case had dominated television news. His face had appeared on magazine covers. Millions of people knew his story. And inside prison walls, plenty of inmates knew it too. But while he remained on death row, there was a barrier between Scott Peterson and the men who had spent years forming opinions about him. A barrier built out of concrete, steel, prison policy, and isolation. Death row was harsh. There is no question about that. But it also created something else: a layer of protection. And what many people didn't realize was that the prison Scott Peterson was leaving behind had been protecting him in ways that most inmates never experience. On December 8, 2021, Scott Peterson walked back into a courtroom for the first time in years, knowing one thing for certain: he would never be executed. The death sentence that had followed him since 2005 was gone. In its place, a judge imposed a new punishment: life in prison without the possibility of parole. At first glance, it looked like a dramatic improvement. No execution date, no death warrant, no longer one of California's condemned inmates. For many people following the case from the outside, it felt like Scott Peterson had escaped the harshest punishment the state could impose. But there was something about this new sentence that many people overlooked. Life without parole is not freedom. It is not a second chance. It is not a sentence that ends after a certain number of years. There is no parole hearing waiting decades down the road. No opportunity to stand before a board and argue for release. No countdown. No finish line. Under the sentence imposed in December 2021, Scott Peterson would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The only question was where. For nearly 2 decades, he had existed inside the unique world of San Quentin's death row. Now, California's prison system had to decide where a man like Scott Peterson belonged. That process took time. Months passed. Then, more than a year after his resentencing, the decision was finally made. In October 2022, Scott Peterson was transferred from San Quentin State Prison to Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California. The move didn't generate nearly as many headlines as the death sentence reversal, but in many ways, it would prove far more significant, because Scott Peterson wasn't simply changing prisons, he was entering an entirely different world. After the transfer, Peterson's attorney, Pat Harris, spoke publicly about what the move would mean. His description sounded simple enough. He said Scott Peterson would have what he called a more normal prison life. A more normal prison life. It sounds almost comforting, until you stop and think about what normal means inside a prison. Normal means shared recreation yards. Normal means shared dining halls. Normal means walking among hundreds of other inmates every day. Normal means increased movement, increased interaction, and increased visibility. In many ways, life at Mule Creek offered opportunities that simply didn't exist on death row. Educational programs, work assignments, religious services, recreation with other inmates. A daily routine that looked much closer to what most people imagine when they think about prison. For the average inmate, those changes might have been viewed as an improvement. But Scott Peterson was not an average inmate, and that distinction changed everything. Because when most prisoners enter a new facility, they arrive as strangers. Their names mean nothing. Their faces are unfamiliar. They blend into the population. Scott Peterson could never do that. Long before he arrived at Mule Creek, millions of Americans already knew exactly who he was. His case had dominated television news. His trial had become one of the most watched criminal proceedings of the early 2000s. Books had been written about him. Documentaries had been produced about him. Debates about his guilt and innocence had continued for years. And prisons are not isolated from the outside world. Inmates watch television. They read newspapers. They follow major criminal cases. Many had spent years hearing about Scott Peterson before he ever stepped foot inside Mule Creek. When he arrived, he wasn't anonymous. He wasn't just another inmate transferring from another facility. He was Scott Peterson's, the man convicted of murdering his wife, Lassie Peterson, and their unborn son, Connor Peterson. And that reputation arrived long before he did. Because inside prison walls, reputation often matters just as much as the sentence itself. By the time Scott Peterson arrived at Mule Creek State Prison in October 2022, he wasn't entering a place where nobody knew his name. Quite the opposite. Few inmates entering the California prison system carry the kind of notoriety that Scott Peterson does. More than 20 years after Lassie Peterson disappeared on Christmas Eve, 2002, the case remains one of the most discussed criminal cases in American history. People still debate it, still write about it, still produce documentaries about it, and still argue about what happened. For many Americans, Scott Peterson's name immediately brings back the same images. A pregnant wife, a nationwide search, months of media coverage, a trial that dominated headlines, and a verdict that divided opinions across the country. Whether people followed every detail or only remembered the headlines, they remembered him. And that reality didn't stop at the prison gates, because prisons are communities of their own. Information travels, stories spread. High-profile inmates are rarely anonymous for long, especially inmates whose cases became part of American true crime history. When Scott Peterson arrived at Mule Creek, he entered a facility housing some of California's most serious offenders, men serving decades, men serving life sentences, men who know they will likely die in prison. Many of them had spent years following major criminal cases from behind bars, and many already had opinions about Scott Peterson before they ever saw him in person. That created a reality very different from the one he had lived on death row. At San Quentin, isolation had largely defined his existence. At Mule Creek, visibility became unavoidable. Every trip to the dining hall, every recreation period, every walk across art, every interaction, every face, every conversation. For most inmates, prison is difficult enough. But for an inmate whose case became a national obsession, every day comes with an additional layer of attention. Because unlike the outside world, prison doesn't give people much space to escape their reputation. Inside, labels stick, stories follow you, and opinions can become part of your daily reality. Former correctional officers and prison experts have often described reputation as a form of currency inside correctional facilities. Sometimes it earns respect, sometimes it creates conflict, sometimes it does both. The problem for someone like Scott Peterson is that he has no control over how other inmates view him. Every person he encounters arrives with their own opinions, their own assumptions, their own judgments, and unlike death row, there is no wall separating him from those opinions anymore. That doesn't automatically mean violence. It doesn't automatically mean danger, but it does mean exposure, constant exposure, to people who know his face, know his name, know his case, and have had more than 20 years to decide what they think about it. For Scott Peterson, that became the new reality of prison life, not the isolation of death row, not the silence of a condemned housing unit, but life among hundreds of other inmates who already knew exactly who he was before he ever arrived. And for more than 2 years, that reality remained mostly eventful. Then came a Sunday morning in March 2025 that showed exactly what that reality can look like. Sunday, March 9th, 2025. For Scott Peterson, it began as an ordinary morning, at least as ordinary as life can be for a man serving life without parole inside a California state prison. Somewhere inside Mule Creek State Prison, inmates moved through their weekend routines. Recreation periods were underway. Men gathered in the yard. Others walked the recreation paths that cut through the facility. Among them was Scott Peterson, more than 20 years removed from the case that made him one of the most recognizable inmates in America. Peterson was participating in a game that has become increasingly popular inside correctional facilities across the country. Pickleball. It's a detail that almost sounds strange given the circumstances. But for inmates serving decades behind bars, recreation isn't just about exercise. It's a break from routine, a chance to move, a chance to make the hours pass a little differently. On that morning, Peterson was on the court with a paddle in his hand. Then something happened. A ball rolled away from the playing area. Peterson ran after it. What happened next would quickly become the subject of prison reports, media coverage, and national headlines. Another inmate, 39-year-old Charles R. Miles, was walking nearby. Miles was serving a lengthy sentence for murder and had spent years inside California's prison system. According to the account he would later give, he looked up and saw a man moving quickly in his direction. That man was carrying what appeared to be an object in his hand. In reality, it was a pickleball paddle, but according to Miles, he didn't process it that way. He later claimed he believed someone was charging toward him with a weapon. What happened after that unfolded in seconds. A physical confrontation erupted. Correctional officers responded immediately. According to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, staff were forced to use chemical agents and batons to stop the attack and regain control of the situation. That detail alone tells investigators something important. Chemical agents and batons are not typically deployed for minor disagreements. Those measures are generally reserved for situations where staff determine immediate intervention is necessary to stop violence before it escalates further. When the confrontation ended, both inmates were medically evaluated. Scott Peterson sustained minor injuries. So did Charles Miles. Neither inmate required outside hospitalization, and by the end of the day, Peterson had been returned to his housing unit. On paper, it looked like a relatively brief prison altercation. The kind of incident that occurs inside correctional facilities more often than most people realize, but then details began emerging, and suddenly the story became something much bigger. because when Charles Miles later spoke about what happened, he made a claim that immediately changed the way people viewed the incident. He said he didn't know it was Scott Peterson, not during the confrontation, not before it, not when he reacted. According to Miles, this wasn't an attack on one of America's most infamous convicted killers. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't retaliation. It wasn't an inmate trying to target a notorious name. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, a split-second decision made under circumstances he believed were threatening. And then came the statement that would be quoted across news reports nationwide. When asked why the incident happened, Miles gave an answer that was as brief as it was unsettling. It was God's plan. 4 words, that's all. No lengthy explanation. No detailed justification. Just 4 words that seemed to raise more questions than they answered. And that is precisely why the story exploded beyond the walls of Mule Creek. Because if Charles Miles was telling the truth, then the attack wasn't really about Scott Peterson at all. But if a man who didn't even recognize Scott Peterson could end up in a violent confrontation with him, what did that say about the reality of Peterson's life inside a prison where hundreds of inmates do know exactly who he is? What did it say about the environment he now lived in? What did it say about the protections he lost when he left death row? For years, Scott Peterson had been separated from the general population by layers of security, isolation, and prison policy. Now, for the first time, the risks of that new reality were becoming impossible to ignore. And the attack on March 9th, 2025, would force people to ask a question few had considered before. Did leaving death row actually make Scott Peterson safer, or had it exposed him to an entirely different kind of danger? The attack on March 9th, 2025, sparked a debate that extends far beyond Scott Peterson. Because once the headlines faded and the details became clear, people began asking a question that would have sounded almost impossible a few years earlier. Did Scott Peterson actually lose a layer of protection when he left death row? At first, the answer seems obvious. Most people hear the words death row and immediately imagine the harshest conditions a prison system can impose. And in many respects, that's true. Death row is built around restriction, isolation, control. For years, Scott Peterson lived in a world where nearly every aspect of his existence was regulated. His movement was limited, his interactions were limited, his access to the outside world was limited. The psychological burden of living under a death sentence has been studied for decades. Legal scholars and mental health experts have written extensively about what some call the death row phenomenon. The emotional strain associated with years, sometimes decades, of waiting under a sentence of death. For many inmates, the uncertainty becomes its own punishment. Days become months, months become years, years become decades. And all the while, life continues somewhere else. Friends grow older, families change, the world moves on. But inside death row, time often feels frozen. Viewed from that perspective, there is no question that death row carries an extraordinary psychological cost. But there is another side to that reality, a side that became much harder to ignore after Scott Peterson arrived at Mule Creek. Because death row's isolation doesn't just separate inmates from freedom, it separates them from other prisoners. The walls that restrict movement also create distance. Distance from conflict, distance from prison politics, distance from the unpredictable realities that come with living among hundreds of other inmates. General population operates differently. In many ways, it offers freedoms that death row does not. More movement, more activities, more interaction, more opportunities to participate in educational programs, religious services, recreation, and work assignments. For many inmates, those things matter enormously. Human beings are social creatures. Interaction matters, routine matters, purpose matters. But every benefit comes with a trade-off. Because more interaction also means more exposure, more opportunities for conflict, more opportunities for misunderstandings, more opportunities for violence. And for someone like Scott Peterson, visibility becomes impossible to escape. Most inmates arrive at a prison and eventually blend into the background. Scott Peterson never could. His name arrived before he did. Every dining hall, every recreation yard, every walkway, every housing unit, his story follows him. And unlike death row, there is no institutional barrier standing between him and the opinions of the people around him. That doesn't mean every inmate wants to harm him. Far from it. But it does mean he lives in an environment where hundreds of people already know who he is and have formed their own conclusions about one of the most famous criminal cases in American history. The attack involving Charles Miles illustrated that reality in a way few people expected, not because it was a targeted assault. In fact, Miles claimed the opposite. The incident drew attention because it highlighted something larger. Scott Peterson now exists in a world where interactions happen constantly, a world where isolation has been replaced by exposure, a world where the protections of death row no longer exist, and that's where the debate begins. Some observers argue that life without parole, in general population, is unquestionably better than death row. More freedom, more activity, more human contact. Others point to the risks that come with that freedom, the loss of separation, the loss of anonymity, the loss of the protective barriers that once surrounded him. There is no easy answer. What is clear is that Scott Peterson's life changed dramatically when he left San Quentin. The sentence changed, the prison changed, the environment changed. And whether that change made life better or worse depends largely on which part of prison life you believe matters most. But while Scott Peterson was adjusting to life at Mule Creek, another battle was unfolding far from the recreation yards and pruz and prison housing units. A battle that could ultimately have a far greater impact on his future. Because while prison life changed dramatically, another battle was quietly continuing in the courts. For most inmates serving life without parole, the future is relatively easy to predict. The prison where they live today will likely be the prison where they die. The legal process ends, the appeals run out, the headlines disappear, and eventually the outside world moves on. But Scott Peterson's case has never followed a normal path. More than 2 decades after his conviction, the legal battle is still alive. And that may be the most remarkable part of the story. Because while Scott Peterson was adjusting to life at Mule Creek State Prison, another fight was quietly unfolding inside courtrooms, law offices, and legal filings. A fight centered on a question that has divided people for years. Did the justice system get it right? In January 2023, the Los Angeles Innocence Project announced it was taking on Peterson's case. The decision immediately generated attention. Organizations dedicated to wrongful conviction cases do not typically involve themselves in cases unless they believe there are legal issues worth examining, and few cases carried a higher profile than Scott Peterson's. The announcement reignited a debate that many believed had already been settled. Supporters saw it as evidence that ceaseless legal professionals believed important questions remained unanswered. Critics saw it very differently. They pointed out that Peterson's conviction had survived years of scrutiny, appeals, and judicial review. But regardless of where people stood, one thing was undeniable. The case was no longer confined to the past. It was moving forward again. Meanwhile, Scott Peterson remained at Mule Creek State Prison, serving life without parole as the legal battle continued far beyond the prison walls. Over the next several years, Peterson's legal team and attorneys, working with the Los Angeles Innocence Project, focused on several key arguments. One of the most significant involved testimony presented during the original trial regarding the development of Connor Peterson. Jurors in 2004 heard expert testimony that prosecutors argued helped establish a timeline consistent with their theory of the case. Years later, Peterson's legal team argued that advancements in medical knowledge and differing expert opinions called portions of that timeline into question. According to the petition, newer interpretations could potentially support a different time frame than the one presented to jurors during the original proceedings. If true, the defense argued, that could affect how certain events in the case were viewed. The challenge wasn't simply about science, it was about timing. And timing had always been central to the prosecution's theory. Peterson's legal team also continued raising questions about juror-related issues connected to the original trial. Those arguments centered on whether information provided during jury selection had been complete, and whether certain disclosures should have been handled differently. These issues had been debated for years. Now they were once again becoming part of the legal conversation. Then came a major setback. On April 28, 2026, a California judge denied Peterson's habeas corpus petition. The ruling represented a significant victory for prosecutors and a major disappointment for Peterson's supporters. The court determined that the arguments presented did not justify overturning the conviction. For many observers, the decision appeared to close another door. But it did not end the fight, because Peterson's legal team and the Los Angeles Innocence Project made it clear they intended to continue pursuing available legal avenues. Appeals remained active. Additional challenges remained under consideration, and the broader debate surrounding the case showed no signs of disappearing. Today, Scott Peterson continues to maintain that he is innocent. That position has never changed. Not during his trial, not during his years on death row, not after being sentenced to life without parole, and not now. Meanwhile, every court that has reviewed the conviction itself has left the guilty verdicts in place. That reality creates an unusual situation: a man serving life without parole, a conviction that remains intact, an innocence claim that remains active, and a legal battle that continues more than 20 years after it began. Which brings us to the question that has hovered over this case for decades. After all the appeals, after all the hearings, after all the documentaries, books, investigations, and legal challenges, could anything still change? Or has Scott Peterson already reached the end of the road? As of 2026, that answer remains uncertain. But whether the courts ultimately agree to hear new arguments or not, one thing is clear: the legal battle may be far from over. Today, Scott Peterson is 53 years old. He wakes up each morning at Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California. He is no longer a death row inmate. He is no longer housed inside the isolation that defined much of his first 17 years behind bars. And yet, despite all of the legal developments, all of the appeals, and all of the headlines that continue to appear from time to time, one fact remains unchanged. Scott Peterson is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. There is no release date, no parole hearing, no scheduled path back into society. Every morning begins inside the same prison walls, and every evening ends there. The man who once dominated national headlines now lives a life defined largely by routine: prison counts, meals, recreation periods, legal paperwork, conversations with attorneys, the repetitive rhythm of a sentence measured not in years, but in whatever time remains. Yet even now, more than 2 decades after his conviction, the story is not completely frozen. His legal team continues to pursue challenges. The Los Angeles Innocence Project continues its efforts. Appeals remain active. Arguments continue. Peterson continues to maintain that he is innocent, and supporters continue to argue that important questions remain unanswered. Any of those efforts ultimately change the outcome is something no one can predict. For now, the conviction stands. The sentence stands, and Scott Peterson remains exactly where he has spent most of the last 23 years of his life: behind bars. Which brings us back to the question that has followed this story from the very beginning of this video. Did leaving death row actually improve Scott Peterson's life? On paper, many people would say yes. He gained greater freedom of movement, greater access to prison programs, more interaction with other inmates, a life that looked more like general population and less like the isolation of condemned housing. But the attack in March 2025 revealed another side of that reality. The protections of death row were gone. The separation was gone. The barriers that once stood between Scott Peterson and the rest of the prison population were gone. What replaced them was visibility, exposure, and the daily reality of living among hundreds of inmates who know exactly who he is. Whether that makes life better or worse depends largely on how someone defines punishment. Some would choose human interaction over isolation every time. Others would point to the risks, the constant recognition, and the possibility of violence that comes with being one of the most infamous prisoners in America. There is no simple answer, and perhaps that's why the debate continues. But regardless of where someone stands on Scott Peterson himself, it is important to remember who remains at the center of this story: Lachi Peterson, a 27-year-old woman whose life was cut short just as she was preparing to become a mother, and Connor Peterson, a child who never had the opportunity to experience the life waiting for him. The legal arguments may continue, the appeals may continue, the public debate may continue, new filings may appear, new rulings may be issued, and documentaries like this one may continue examining every development that emerges. But for Lachi Peterson's family, there is one reality that no appeal can change, No court can reverse it. No legal argument can erase it. Lossie Peterson is gone. Connor Peterson is gone. And the loss they left behind remains permanent. For now, Scott Peterson remains at Mule Creek State Prison. The courts continue their work. The debate continues. And one of America's most infamous criminal cases remains unfinished in the minds of many who still follow it. But whatever the future holds, the story ultimately begins and ends with the people who never got the chance to tell it themselves. And that is why this case still matters today.